Hello, my name is Amir Badat, and thank you for tuning in for today's panel discussion, the VRA at 58, Strategies to Define the Future of the Voting Rights Act. I serve as voting special counsel and the manager of the Prepared to Vote and Voting Rights Defender projects at the Legal Defense Fund, and I am honored to be joined today by our president and director counsel, Janai Nelson, as well as some of our incredible clients and partners in the work to defend and expand voting rights nationwide, including Evan Milligan, the executive director of Alabama Forward and named plaintiff in Allen versus Milligan, Ashley Shelton, president and CEO of the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice in Louisiana, and another plaintiff organization represented by LDF in redistricting and voting rights cases. And finally, Jayla Allen, a rising civil rights leader who was a plaintiff represented by LDF during her time as a student at Prairie View A&M University. I'm really excited and honored to be joined by this esteemed panel today. This year marks 58 years since the Voting Rights Act was signed on August 6, 1965, and a decade since the Supreme Court undermined key protections of the VRA in Shelby County versus Holder. While Congress still holds the power to restore the VRA to its strongest form, advocates on the ground like our speakers today have not wasted any time in continuing to fight for voting rights in their communities. They have brought pivotal litigation under the intact provisions of the VRA. They have advanced innovative reforms in their states, and they have organized voters at the polls in their communities and from their state houses to our nation's capital. I, again, am excited to learn from these leaders who are on the front lines of the fight to defend voting rights. And I hope that all of those who are tuning in today will join the movement to restore the protections of the VRA and fulfill the promises of our multiracial democracy. So with all of that said, Janai, I'd like to start off the panel discussion with you, and I'd like to ask you to help ground us and ground this conversation in the history of the Voting Rights Act. The VRA is widely hailed as the most effective piece of civil rights legislation, perhaps the most effective piece of legislation generally in our nation's history. And it was the product of years of organizing, strategy, collaboration between advocates on the ground, between national leaders and legal experts. And so I'd like to ask, what was LDF's role in the movement to pass the VRA, and how do we walk in that history through our work today?
Amir, thank you so much for that introduction and that excellent question. It's wonderful to be part of this conversation with our clients, and especially as we commemorate this moment in our democracy's history. As I said, it's such a good question because so many people don't know the central role that LDF played in helping to secure the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So many people know about our enforcement of that legislation, but not the origin of it. And our work to advance the voting rights of Black people in this country really is anchored in that particular struggle to get the Voting Rights Act passed. As you mentioned, there were a series of marches in the fight to pass the Voting Rights Act. There was a march that started about 25 miles north of Selma in Marion County that SCLC helped to organize among residents to rally people to get registered to vote and to push back against the disenfranchisement that so many were experiencing. And as part of that demonstration, there was a very violent response from state troopers and policemen and angry civilians and a Dallas County sheriff called Jim Clark. And unfortunately, a tragic result of that encounter was that Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was only 26 years old at the time and was a protester who was trying to protect his mother from police violence, was ultimately killed by the state. And that set off a series of protests and additional marches, ones that were then anchored in Selma, where you had people like Diane Nash and her husband, James Bevel, and others like SNCC and SCNC advanced the work of Dr. King and John Lewis, of course, a very young John Lewis, who was part of the many freedom fighters who ultimately were able to traverse the Edmund Pettus Bridge. But it was not without significant obstacles. John Lewis and Hosea Williams, who were aides of Dr. King, they led the march known as Bloody Sunday. And as they tried to cross the bridge initially, they were met with troopers and posse men who brutalized them and sparked more demonstrations. And it was at that time that LDF got involved in protecting the First Amendment rights of these marchers. And we filed a case called Williams versus Wallace, Jose Williams versus George Wallace, then Governor George Wallace, to protest the violence that occurred on that bridge. And it was heinous. It was broadcast across the world. And it really instigated a national movement to help the Voting Rights Act get passed, which President Lyndon Johnson did 4.5 months later. So LDF's work in charting the path for the march from Selma to Montgomery, getting the court order, ensuring that adequate federal protections were in place, were essential to putting that movement over the line in getting the Voting Rights Act ultimately passed. And then, of course, we've spent the next nearly 60 years trying to enforce it as vigorously as possible.
Evan, I'd like to turn to you, and Janai just walked us through this kind of remarkable history, much of which took place in Alabama. The march from Selma to Montgomery, which was critical to the passage of the VRA 58 years ago. Just this year, the Supreme Court, in a case in your own name, determined that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prohibits racial discrimination and redistricting, could live on today. And so can you talk a little bit about how the history of your community in Alabama helps shape your perspectives on your own role in this moment? And also, how does participating in litigation like the Allen versus Milligan case, how has that enabled you to advocate on behalf of your community and for voting rights in Alabama?
Thank you, Amir. For me, growing up in Alabama really introduced me to the importance of story, identity, and also field work that that really prioritizes building relationships across caste lines. So, for example, my father was born in Texas, but my mother and her entire side is from Alabama, and this is where I was raised. I'm 6 generations removed from enslavement, and my maternal side, my family here in Alabama, all come from Lowndes County, a small town named Lounsboro. And the land that we own there has dwindled down to a small plot that we now use as a family cemetery. But my connection to the story of my family is not abstract. I know the histories of the people in the cemetery, and because I knew many of them personally. They were Big Mama, Big Daddy, Aunt Gladys, Aunt Madge. These were folks that were born in 1905, 1927, 1911. And then, my parents having been born in 1945, 1952. And all of these folks, to some degree or another, were supportive of the Black liberation movements of their day. They could have been, casual volunteers, joining, the civic groups like the Masons or the Delta Sigma Theta, or they could have been actually volunteering in the bus boycott to drive the station wagon. My parents did more formal stuff. But what I'll say about that is, my household wasn't unique in that respect. If anything, my family was one of the smaller families here. And of all the families that I've met, Black families that have been in the Black Belt region of the state for more than 4 or 5 generations, and the Black Belt region would be the central part from where a lot of when we think of Selma, Montgomery, Tuskegee, those are all Black Belt communities. So Black folks that I know that have been living there for 4 or 5 generations, I don't know any who don't have a similar connection to at least some involvement in the movements that their relatives were alive to experience. I think that was pretty commonplace here, and that's a part of our story. It's a part of our identity. It means that the grocer and the lawyer and the maintenance staff and the person that might work from the street economy. These people know each other. And so when you have these political moments, having a language and having an ability to get in the field and persuade, build relationships, build alliances, that's really ingrained in the culture. It's ingrained in how people greet each other. And so that shaped me as a child. And also because I've worked primarily here in Alabama with groups focusing on Black communities or human rights, social justice more broadly, I've seen these same communities impact that work as well. And working with LDF was a unique opportunity because there aren't many places that I've found in the world that actually value learning about these identities and these stories of Alabamians, particularly in terms of how we connect to each other across caste lines within the Black community. And LDF's approach to the litigation for our case was one of the first times where, you know, I worked with someone who wasn't from here, didn't have a literal office here, who was really interested in connecting all of those details to the goals of the project. In this instance, it was litigation, and preparing for our preliminary injunction hearing with Dr. Brittany Carter, one of LDF's attorneys. It was just this very unexpected time to find, oh, wait a minute, you want to hear these stories? There's some use for this in this context. And so I think that's something that, piggybacked on what our work with Alabama Forward has been trying to do, and really helping Alabamians understand the value of our identities, our stories, and working across these lines. So it was a great opportunity to experience that within the context of this litigation.
Thanks for sharing that, Evan. And Ashley, let me turn it over to you now. In addition to Alabama, Louisiana was one of the jurisdictions that was covered in its entirety under the pre-clearance protections of the Voting Rights Act before it was gutted in the Shelby decision in 2013. So how have you and the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice been able to not only hold the line for voting rights without the full protections of the VRA, but also to push the needle forward for voting rights through policy and through organizing and litigation efforts?
Thank you, Amir. As Power Coalition has been working to expand voting rights throughout the state of Louisiana, we knew redistricting was always going to be the North Star, that if you really talk about building power, that redistricting is one of the most powerful ways that we do that. And, through, the redistricting process, we saw unprecedented, historic participation by African Americans and other people of color throughout our state who fought for and asked for two things specifically. One, a fair and equitable process, and two, to realize a second minority congressional district. And, I think with the Supreme Court's decision in Milligan, it creates a clear pathway for us to actually realize that. And when I think about the Voting Rights Act, in its entirety, as we waited for that decision, much like everyone, I think one of the things that was really important was, holding on to the reality that the Voting Rights Act is, one of the single most powerful pieces of, voting rights and civil rights legislation, as well as the reality that if we didn't have an opportunity to continue to hold at least, at least what was left of the Voting Rights Act in Section 2, that, many people of color already live in this country and walk in this country as what feels like a second-class citizen. But what would have happened if we would have lost, Section 2, for me was just this idea that we were going to codify into law, right? Like that as a Black woman in America, that I couldn't elect candidates of choice. I couldn't actually do anything about who was leading in my community, who was representing me. And so for many of us, the Supreme Court ruling in Milligan is, is a bright star that, the Voting Rights Act and Section 2 continue to be law of the land. Since, Shelby was pulled from the Voting Rights Act, gutted from the Voting Rights Act. One of the things that I've been really proud of is that as many states across the country have been suppressing the vote, Louisiana's been able to actually expand voting rights in our state for the last several years. Really proud. The Legal Defense Fund leads and supports our election protection programming, and our election protection work actually drives a policy agenda. And so those issues that our voters are encountering in every election, we then use that to actually build out our policy agenda for the legislative session. And so really proud of the fact that we have been able to expand early voting in presidential elections, that we have been able to end, archaic processes around how much time someone could spend in the voting booth. Also, most recently being able to have a big win for our disability community by having the Secretary of State's office actually put an American Disabilities Act compliance officer within the Secretary of State's office, and also to create ongoing education and training for poll workers around all of the protections for our disability community. And then, also creating a continuous voice by putting in place, a committee that will continue to inform and talk to the Secretary of State's office about issues that our disability community has been facing. And so, for Power Coalition, it has been, our honor to work with and on behalf of the citizens of the state to be able to continue that fight, continue to expand voting rights, and continue to say that, again, I am a citizen. I should have the right to elect candidates of choice. I should have the ability to, take full advantage of early voting, to be able to actually protect, our disability community. And one of the things that I love about this particular win was also just, the realization that when we protect any voter, we protect all voters. And that's what this, most recent win made very clear, that, if you think about curb cuts, I mean, that is something that is specifically around supporting access for the disability community, but it's something that we all use. And so thinking about the ways in which we're expanding access and creating accountability, I'm really, really proud of that work and the opportunity to participate and serve the citizens of Louisiana.
Thank you, Ashley. And I appreciate you kind of drawing that line between the various different tools that are available to us: litigation, policy, organizing. I think these are all incredibly important tools that are all connected tools in terms of expanding and defending our voting rights. Jayla, both Ashley and Evan mentioned the role of litigation and the importance that plays in the advocacy work that they have done in Alabama and in Louisiana. As a student leader at Prairie View, you were involved with LDF and litigation to defend HBCU students' ability to vote on campus. Can you speak to the importance of young people engaging in voter mobilization and turnout on their campuses and beyond, especially in this moment when the rights of Black students have been under unique assault across the country?
Thank you, Amir, for that question. And yes, this is one of my favorite questions. As a student at Prairie View, I started out before being involved in Allen v. Waller as a client of LDF. I was a precinct chair, and three of the main things that we focused on while I was organizing on the campus was registration, participation, and education for young students. And this gears students up and engages them to understanding the political realm of things, also civic engagement, and giving them the tools to really participate not only in elections and voting, but within their communities. And I think once we look at not just HBCU specifically, yes, but also young people, and looking back to the civil rights movement, it was people, young youth and students who were leading this fight, who were organizing on their campuses. And that's exactly what I saw what I did while I was at Prairie View. And you see the importance of youth. I once read a statistic that said people and young people, between the ages of 18 and 24, if they vote between those ages, they are more likely to vote consistently throughout their adulthood if they start between the ages of 18 and 24. And so and I saw this personally while organizing on the campus. We saw that this was true, that if students became civically engaged at this time and were able to come together and organize themselves, after leaving college, they were more likely to continue this civic engagement and participation within their communities. I think there's something especially special about young people and our abilities to organize ourselves and to do different forms of protest. So rather it is participating in a local council meeting within your city council, or writing letters to your state senate or congressman. And then also I got to be a plaintiff as in the case with LDF. And so you see these different forms, but I think more than anything, we see the collective power that youth have. And again, HBCUs are so special. I had the privilege of being able to continue the legacy at Prairie View, where the fight for students and Black students and their voting rights really started with the Sims case that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and ultimately allowed students to be able to vote on their college campuses using their address. And so we see that it has been a continuous fight, yes, but also showing the power of young people today and continuing to do so across the board. And because today we are fighting so many of the same fights, rather it's voting rights on HBCU campuses or on college campuses across America more generally, we see that a lot of young Black youth are at the forefront of this fight, and they continue to organize and mobilize the collective power of youth. And I think that while youth has the ability to show that, one, that we are more than capable of doing so and organizing ourselves, it also shows that in the long run, we are here and that we are ready to fight and to continue to carry the torch of those who came before us, like John Lewis, who was 18 years old when he was a part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and crossed the bridge that ultimately led to securing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So I think today, to say that, yes, the fight continues at HBCUs and on their campuses, but across America, and we see young people showing up and ready and have the ability to organize every day.
And I think that's such an important point, Jayla, kind of where you ended. There's always this narrative that young people aren't engaged in the civic process in our government and in politics. But I think young people, this generation that is now able to vote in particular, are really showing that they are engaged. And the turnout numbers really have shown that for the past couple of elections. The younger generations have been turning out in remarkable numbers, historical numbers. And so I'm glad that you really highlighted that. Evan, let me turn it back over to you and circle back to something that you touched on in your first answer related to civic participation in your community. How do you inspire civic participation in your community, and how do you meet people where they are and connect that with the rights and protections enshrined in the Voting Rights Act?
Thank you. So, very honestly, this is a question that we are still answering and questioning the answers and then answering again. It's a constant process. But within our network at Alabama Forward, we work with a few fields of social influencers to explore the answer to that question. One of the fields, is who we traditionally think of when we think of grassroots level advocacy. So those are organizers, direct service providers, advocates working either at the community-based level, regionally within the state, or statewide. And with those folks, the goal is to really make sure that they have the leverage and the resources they need to stay in the game, to keep their field workers motivated and trained. So we provide them grants, technical assistance, promotional platforms, and also direct connections to national organizations and networks. Another field would be influencers who are creatives. So that would be visual artists, musicians, digital content creators. Um, we work with them to produce original music because, thinking back to the movements that I mentioned, so many of our relatives haven't been affiliated with or participating in. All of those movements produce some type of original music or visual content, something cultural at the local level. Um, and so, we work with those creatives to do block parties, festivals that invite people in. Creatives are really, really good at doing something that can be trickier for organizers or policy folks, and that's focusing on what we're actually dreaming about. What are we for? What are we hoping for? What do we love? What are we inviting people into? And not only what are we in opposition to. So working with those creatives helps us to make sure that we're producing those types of that type of cultural um, um, space for people to come in. And then also another field would be working with small business owners and philanthropists, really to make sure that they're invested in the work, that they're networked to everyone else I mentioned already, and that we're also building a space in a shared political home that also invites them there. And all of those different groups have very, very different interests. So the reason I say we're still figuring it out is just showing up and everyone being Black or everyone being identifying themselves as pro-democracy. That's not enough to build a strategy. That can be a great time, and those can be great personal relationships. But in terms of actually having a strategic response or even a proactive forward motion that can overcome this growing authoritarianism and far right expansion in our country and around the world, it really takes defined strategy and defined goals. So one growing edge for our coalition now is really maturing in terms of our ability to design and execute field plans at the local level and also statewide. It's critical that we hit that note right, because we have to decide if the 21st century will be defined by authoritarianism or the expansion of multicultural democracy. And only one of those is in the best interest of the largest number of my people. So for us, being able to contribute to that larger goal will require us growing and nailing down some details with regards to our ability to build field plans and really know reliably how many people in a given community we can impact or turn out, or at least know how to reach. And that's where our coalition is right now, and that certainly has been something we've dug into with regards to our involvement on the case and advocacy around Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and then connecting that to efforts to get the John Lewis Act passed at the federal level, or the Freedom to Vote Act. For us, that all starts with the ground and the work we're doing there.
So building off of that, Ashley, I'd like to ask you kind of how does participating in litigation that is enabled by the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, how does that fold into your model of advocacy at the Power Coalition? And what are some other concrete ways that people in Louisiana and across the South and beyond can can best support your frontline efforts to expand and protect voting rights?
Yes, one of the things that we talk about all the time is that, your vote is your voice, is your power. And, the litigation that we are participating in with LDF to realize a second minority congressional seat here in Louisiana, one of the things that's most important is that it is a clear indicator of what the power of voice can do, right? Like their voice, their participation, their consistent, kind of showing up throughout the redistricting process, really created, like a powerful staircase, or if you will, or a pathway to actually realizing this district. But that's just part of the win, right? Like that's just part of the work. We have to continue to fight. We've got a court case ahead of us. We've got, many opportunities for folks to participate, to show up, to have their voices heard throughout this process of actually realizing this district, and then also stand in their power and actually vote in this, in this new district, and ensure that they are actually realizing a candidate of choice in their community. And we've heard, as we've been fighting this fight and, and working with LDF in this litigation, that folks feel like you can create this, but you may not be able to get African-American voters to turn out to actually realize a candidate of choice. And I push back against that. I said, we have not done all of this work. We have not had unprecedented participation in redistricting and actually realizing what community asked for, which was, because we couldn't get fairness, right? We had to litigate, but we could, in the place of that fair and equitable process, use litigation to actually realize it. And that now that we've got a clear pathway there, for me, it's really folks standing in their, standing in their power, standing in these wins, understanding that, it is just as important now as it was 50 years ago to, to continue to fight for our right to choose candidates of choice, to be able to vote, to not find ourselves, falling into, voter suppression tactics. One of the other ways that I think people have to continue to engage is that one of the things that redistricting did was create a very large platform for people across the state to engage at all levels of government. And so even though I'm a litigant around the congressional maps, there's so many constituents and community members that are also working on school board cases, the state maps here in Louisiana, which will be going to court in November. All of these are opportunities for community to show up and to continue to participate, to allow people to continue to see that this is unbelievably important to our communities. This is important to our state. As a state with 33% African American population, being able to actually realize not only a pathway to this congressional seat, to also realize the potential impact of Section 2 on all of our maps. And so for us, it's that continued participation, continue to show up, and whether it's in federal court to support, Power Coalition and other partners, and certainly our lawyers and with Legal Defense Fund, but to be there. And so, for us, this really is about continuously showing up. And I'm proud to say that whether it is us doing work at the Capitol on state policy, we've had our community continuously show up and have their voices heard. And so I ask folks, have those in-district meetings with your legislators, have those, take the time to pick up the phone and make that call, take the time to send that email. And Power Coalition uses a lot of tools to make that very easy for citizens to engage. And also too, as we continue to go through this process, to realizing this second minority district, I'm really excited to work with community and really build that momentum that says that we did what we set out to do, and now we have to see it all the way through. And so just asking folks to continue to engage, continue to be a part of this fight, to understand that this is actually one of the most fundamental pieces of our democracy that is about power. And so for me, it's just, again, it goes back to quite simply, like, your vote is your voice and your power. And your voice is also needed in all of the ways in which we, continue to fight for justice. And so whether that's, again, making those phone calls, sending those emails, and showing up. And so, and I'm really excited that Louisiana is prepared to continue to show up and fight for voting rights.
Absolutely. Louisiana has been showing up for a long time. And so really appreciate all of the work that you all are doing down there. Jayla, let me bring it back to something that you mentioned when you were speaking initially about kind of the tradition of leadership in the civil rights movement among young people. That's a tradition that you are carrying on. And so I'm wondering, what are some of the lessons that your generation has taken from those who marched before you? And what innovations do you think will help distinguish this next chapter in the fight for voting rights?
What lessons have we not taken from those who've come before us and have fought and were pivotal in the civil rights movement throughout the 60s? As I mentioned earlier, John Lewis, who's always been very inspirational to me, was 18 years old. I myself was 18, 19 years old when I became um, a client of LDF, and not to compare myself to Mr. Lewis, but to say that we stand on their shoulders. They have given us the blueprint of organizing and grassroots at all levels. And you see some of them even went on also to be plaintiffs in cases with LDF and also other organizations. And so it just really shows the power and the abilities of those who came before us that, like I said, given us the blueprint of what can be done. And to also show, and I mentioned this earlier, that young people are more than capable. And the fact that there are rights that need to be defended and that we need to organize to ensure that these rights are protected, I think that who else other than young people today, right, as they were 60 and 70 years ago, fighting this fight. And so the lessons that they've given us, I would say, one, to understand that you're never too young, right? That you hold the same capabilities and the same power as anyone else of any age. And so therefore there's a fight and you are needed and you are to serve in this fight and to continue to do so. And hopefully one day you will also pass that torch on to other young people and those who come behind you. Also, as I mentioned, and I really tone in on this idea of the blueprint that they've given us on how to organize our communities, our campuses. What do we do? How do we participate? I also say that today we are living in a time where there are so many other tools that we get to build on in our fight and being able to use it as we organize our communities and be agents of change. One of the greatest things is social media. We're able to reach people in a much faster rate and a greater level. But I think that the beauty of having those who have come before us and seeing the sacrifices and really ultimately the things that they've given, some gave their lives for this fight. It shows again that you are more than capable, you are never too young, that you hold power, and that you can be a part of change.
Absolutely. Thank you for those inspiring words. Janai, I'd like to come back to you and touch on some of the remarks that have already been made about, the impact that Shelby County has had on the Voting Rights Act and on voter suppression efforts throughout the country, and the effort that Evan mentioned to restore some of the protections of the Voting Rights Act at the federal level. Can you speak to the dual strategies to restore the VRA at the federal level while also looking to state level policy innovations as kind of a new frontier for this work? And also, how can people support this work?
Yeah, thank you. As you've heard, there's so many ways in which you can be involved in the fight to advance Black political participation and ensure that the right to vote is fully protected. And one of the most important charges we have is not only to continue to support the work of our clients in various ways, but to make sure that they have tools and that we all have tools to enforce, to protect our rights and make sure that we are continually expanding them and strengthening them. So one obvious way is to make sure that we have a renewed, restored, and expanded Federal Voting Rights Act. The John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is an example of that. The Freedom to Vote Act, which also adds additional protections and makes voting secure and easy, is another piece of federal legislation that we fully support. But we also know that right now it is a challenge to get such comprehensive voting reform passed in this Congress. And so we're looking on a multiplicity of fronts to try to advance these protections, whether it's at the state level or the local level. The work that needs to be done in light of the rulings in the past decade, like Shelby County, and then more recently, like the Brnovich decision, which actually narrowed Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which was and is the section that remains the most robust. And we just can't afford to lose any piece of that. So what we've been doing is continuing to enforce what we have at our disposal to protect voters, including protesters these days who are fighting for voting rights, like our clients in Allen versus Graham, which is a case out of North Carolina, a very recent one, where voters were marching to the polls in 2020 and were faced with pepper spray and a horrific police response to that activism. And we were able to use Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act to bring a charge of racial discrimination and try to vindicate their rights. We all have talked about the Allen versus Milligan case, which has been just a phenomenal watershed moment in the history of Alabama to increase its congressional representation. But those are very isolated incidences, and we need state protections in the absence of federal protections that are more robust to enable us to really take advantage of the growing political power in Black communities across the country. And central to that effort is what's been happening at the state level, and that is getting voting rights acts passed there that go beyond even what our federal voting rights laws do in the moment. So there are a number of states that are setting an example of what is possible. You have the state of New York, California, Washington, Oregon, Virginia, and then most recently Connecticut, that have passed comprehensive state voting rights acts that build upon the federal VRA and that have developed more protections for Black voters, other voters of color, and other historically marginalized groups so that they can fully and fairly exercise their rights. And we want other states to follow their lead. And we want voters across the country to demand those same protections that these voters in these states now have. By way of example, the Connecticut Voting Rights Act has the strongest state voting rights act that has been passed to date. It has a pre-clearance program that we no longer have because Shelby County disabled Section 5, but we now have it in Connecticut that puts a burden on local governments to record discrimination, to ensure that we get out ahead of it and we prevent it from being implemented, because you can't unring that bell when elections have been held under discriminatory procedures and policies and practices. The Connecticut Voting Rights Act also provides new legal tools to fight discriminatory voting rules in court. It expands language access. It creates strong protections against voter intimidation and deception or obstruction of the right to vote. It also creates a central hub for election data and demographic information that will help empower election officials and community members to ensure that our elections are accessible. So those are very common sense approaches to elections that we want to see enacted across all states. And we are moving forward with campaigns state by state, locale by locale. And people can support this effort by contacting their state legislatures to inquire whether there's a current effort to pass a Voting Rights Act in their state. If not, they can demand one. And they should make it clear that they want the same rights as some of the other protections that other voters in other parts of the country are now enjoying. They can get involved in registering people to vote if they haven't already done so, and engaging with state and local elected officials and staying informed about local elections, including attending their local municipal and school board meetings, sheriff elections, coroner elections. All of these elections matter, and our participation is critical, and really allows us to then have even more influence as we make the demands for greater voter protection. So these are really exciting fronts. But of course, we will continue to push as hard as we possibly can for federal voting rights protections that restore the Voting Rights Act and really expand the protections that are necessary to advance a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy.
Thanks, Janai. And listening to all of you speak and listening to all of the incredible work that is being done in each of your states at the federal level is incredibly inspiring to me, and it helps inspire my work. And I'm wondering, this is a question for everyone on the panel, if you could speak for just a couple of minutes about what inspires you and what gives you hope for the future of Black political power. And let's start off with Evan.
Sure. Well, Black political power is still relatively new, historically speaking. When we think about what actually produced the identities of the people that we refer to when we say the term Black, whether we're talking about people in Gee's Bend, Alabama, or Crown Heights in Brooklyn, Brixton in England, Houston, New Orleans, or San Juan, Bahia, wherever they live. These are folks that those communities emerged on the heels of the largest human migration in history through the transatlantic slave trade. And though we haven't been around very long, we've been through a lot. Our ancestors, who make up our stories, survived everything that the 15th through the 20th centuries could throw at us. And when we think about everything they survived from the late 1400s to today, it's hard not to draw inspiration and hope. There's certainly trauma. There's certainly a lot of deep sadness there. The fact that we exist is a testament to their strength. And that strength shows up again and again in the cycle of life as we have children, as we grow to embody aspects of our ancestors. So when I look at the 21st century, I'm hopeful because that cycle won't end as long as we remember our strength and remain sensitive to our complexities. The challenges we face now are greater than what we faced before in many respects, whether it be climate or technology. But we've never had the tools and the available time that we currently have. So when I look at all of that in total, I'm very hopeful about the future of Black political power.
Thanks so much, Evan. Ashley, let me pose the same question to you.
Sure. I think, there's so much to say, but what I'm hopeful about is that in the case of voting rights in particular, the decisions that came down this year from the Supreme Court, were kind of like a bright light around the fact that, one, we still have to fight as our country becomes more, majority minority. We have to make sure that as we think about power and understand power, that, as Black voters, right, like that we actually do have the full, our full rights. And, and one of the things that, I often tell folks is that, there's clearly an effort to do away with this idea of what it means to be Black in America, to pretend that structural racism does not continue to exist and prevail in many of our communities, in particular in the South. And so I am hopeful that, just through the work that I get to do every day in community, that we will continue to fight and realize, much like Evan said, I have less rights than my grandparents had in this very moment. And so we still have to fight the fights. And even it's unfortunate that we've got to go back and, relitigate, but also shore up so many of those wins from, I mean, at this point, almost 60 years ago, that I am still also inspired by the power of people and the about is that folks keep telling me and have told me for forever all the things that couldn't be done, and and I'm sitting in a moment of lots of wins around things that couldn't be done, and so I will hold that as inspiration, continue to fight and continue to believe in the power of Black voters and what we hope to realize in the future.
Thanks, Ashley. Jayla, what inspires you?
Obviously young people, our ability to organize and to demand our power, recognizing our power, to demand and to bring change and to hold the fire to those who have the ability to enact change at all levels of government and in our communities. I'm extremely hopeful for Black political power, because I think more than anything, we have seen the resiliency of our community, and also our continuous fight, and to pass on these torches to other young people and those who come after us to continue the fight. I'm extremely hopeful because I'm surrounded by communities and partners that build community for us in this fight.
Thanks, Jayla. Janai, I'll let you round us out. What inspires you?
Well, it's impossible to be part of this discussion and not be beyond inspired by the clients that we have the privilege of representing and working with every day, and the staff that we have at the Legal Defense Fund that puts it all on the line on a consistent basis and brings such vigor and passion and intellect to the fight. So that's what personally gives me so much inspiration, to be part of this continuum of advancing and securing Black voting rights, to advance our ability to represent ourselves, to have agency in this country that was never built for us. And the work that we're doing just defies the expectations, defies the systems that were erected for our subjugation. And there's nothing more exhilarating than knowing that we have the ability, by sheer force of will, by amassing all of our powers of the mind, of powers of inspiration, to bring people into this fight to transform not only our conditions, but the conditions of this country as a whole. And so this may seem like a very technical fight about voting or about laws that can be enforced in courts or policies that can be written. But at the end of the day, this is about representation. It's about equity. It's about fairness. It is about freedom. And I am inspired by the people who've done this work as long as this country has been in existence, and our ability to play our role in this moment in time that we have been honored enough to do so.
Thanks so much, Janai. And I know that, like I said before, I'm feeling very inspired, and I really, really want to express my gratitude and my thanks to all of our panelists for joining us today, for sharing the amazing work and your amazing ideas about how we can move forward and continue to protect voting access in this country. So thank you so much to our panelists. And also thank you to everyone who joined us, who tuned in today. I hope that hearing what you've heard today leaves you inspired to take action, and in that vein, to learn more about LDF's voting rights work and how you can get involved. You can visit our website at voting.naacpldf.org or follow us on social media. Thank you so much, and we will see you very soon. LDF